Hi, Platinum members. We are on our last session of making mittens from upcycled sweaters, and we're ready to get to the machine and actually create our mittens today. Now, last evening, I just couldn't resist. I had to make one mitten so that we can finish the pair today. These are so much fun. I know it's getting a little warmer outside, but you may be viewing this in the middle of winter, and you can make a pair of these in no time in an evening. You might get addicted, and I'll show you some more that I've worked on so that once you get started, you just don't want to stop, let me tell you. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, so we have our pieces here all cut out and ready to go. I'm going to slide these up and out of the way. We're going to start working with piece B and C. I know I skipped letter A, but A is going to be in the picture very, very soon. Now, your friendly lint roller or a vacuum is going to be important when you're working with these because you end up having a lot of lint off the edges. Once we're done, all those edges will be in the interior of the mitten, so you won't have any mess later. But in order to keep things neat and tidy, a lint roller is your best friend. And you can see from cutting out my lining that I did have a lot of shearing going on. But once that's gone, then you're pretty much in the clear and you don't wear so much. The sweaters may crumble just a little bit on the edge, but we're not going to be stretching and pulling and tugging on them, so we'll keep that to a minimum. So B and C are the inside portion of your mitten. I'll put this one on so I can demo. We're going to be connecting this piece, the palm, with the wrist piece here that goes around at the base and the outside of our thumb. And there's a very simple seam that we're going to create. I'm going to turn this so that I can look at this. I've got right sides together. I'm going to place them one on top of the other. Kind of keep that in mind because if you seam it and then you turn, you may end up with the wrong side of the knit, the part that you really want to see and showcase, you want to have on the outside. So right sides together with these portions. Now we're going to sew. Let me get a pointer. I'm going to turn this over on the gray. It might be easier for the pointer to show. We are going to stitch across the palm and up around the thumb, and we're going to stop when we get even with this palm seam here. So up across the desert here and up the mountain and down and stop. And we're going to reinforce stitch at the beginning and the end of that seam. So as we go to pin this together, I historically am not a big pinner. I like to try and just wing it, but because we're working with the thickness of the sweater, it is best to put pins in. I will show you in a minute that you can also kind of use those to help you nudge the sweater material under the presser foot. So I'm going to pin about every 1.5 inches or so. Take big bites into it. We're just trying to keep the straight edge or the cut edge aligned, one over the top of the other. And it can easily, especially if you're working on a sweater that has a cable or kind of a ribbing to it, it's kind of lumpy and you want to keep them nested one over the top of the other. And then down into this V area. And I found that the flathead pins, the kind of flower end on them, were really easy to grab a hold of and see when you're working on such um, a thick surface here. So then I'm going to take this to the machine, and we need to do a little bit of setup when we get to our machine. We are going to want to take some of the pressure off of the presser foot. So I'm going to go into my settings, and normally my machine defaults to a 3 for the amount of pressure being put down by the presser foot while I'm sewing. I'm going to reduce that by 2 steps. So I'm going to take it down to a 1, which means that it won't squash the sweater material so much. I'm going to have to make sure that I'm feeding and helping it through, but that way it won't distort the edge as much, and it'll make it a little bit easier maneuver through the machine. And I'm going to set my stitch length about 1 or 2 steps longer than you would if you were, say, quilting. Sometimes a machine will default to 2.0. I'm going to set mine at 3. Okay, so getting the machine set up is important before you start. we are going to be starting our stitching, and I've placed my pin just a little lower than that palm seam. So I'm going to start just in front of that pin with a secure stitch there, and then move my way up around the thumb. So as I put it under the machine, I'm going to use about a 3/8 to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And somewhere in there, doesn't have to be, this isn't quite as precise as, say, fancy tailoring that you're going to be doing. This is going to be on the inside, and it's from upcycled sweaters. So close counts in this case. So I'm going to reinforce stitch there as I begin. Because those pins are long, I can kind of use them to help me nudge my way along so that it feeds nice and even under the machine. And as I approach each pin, I'm going to take it out and move it just beyond the needle. So where the needle's at, I won't damage by hitting the flower pin, but the pin now is moved just beyond the needle position so that I can still use it to help me guide my way up around that thumb area. And I'm using a gray thread because I'm joining a red fabric and a gray. So I figure I could use red, but a medium gray seemed to be a nice neutral for that section for the sewing on the inside of this. And none of our stitching will show on the outside. The seams get so nested together that your thread, as long as it's a neutral, I wouldn't go to a cream color thread. Just it may show through just a tiny bit in a seam. So stick with one of those neutrals that kind of just blends into everything. Now, as I approach the inside of that thumb area, make sure you get past the cut edge by about a 1/4 inch. Leave your needle in the down position. Pick up your presser foot and rotate. So you make a nice clean inner corner there. Pin out and just move it just beyond. I'm kind of using it as almost like an oar or a guiding mechanism by using those pins to my advantage there. And we're just about to the outside of the palm area here. Remember, as you get to it, you're going to want to reinforce stitch at the very end and keep everything tied together nicely. So you can either do a back stitch of a couple stitches, or if your machine has a reinforced stitch, do that at the very end and take it out of the machine. And I'll take my pins out. And a little bit of distortion does occur in the sweaters because you're going through something that has much loft and thickness to it, but it's fairly flat. So we've stitched now up around the thumb and to the outer edge of the palm. And this is the point that if you decide that you have very thin fingers and you want this to be a little narrower, we can do a little fitting at this point. So I'm going to turn this right side out. Gently turn. Now, these aren't a refined mitten. They're kind of a chunky, fun kind of mitten. Probably perfect for going out and having a snowball fight. So as I turn this, my palm is there, like this. Now you can see that we've created the wrist portion and the palm of our mitten. Now, if I fit my hand into this portion, like this, pretending that there's a back there, it is a little bit wide, but I have to remember I'm going to be putting a lining inside of that. So I need a little bit of play, and there's a little bit of swoosh on each side so that my lining will fit in there nicely. You never want to have mittens and gloves that fit really tightly because then it reduces blood flow, makes your fingers cold fast. So I've got enough space in there and the shaping is good. If you decide that you want to have it a little bit smaller, you can then simply turn it back to the stitching on this side, and you can go in and make this a little bit slimmer. Make sure to check you don't take too much off the length of the thumb though, because you have to have enough room to get your finger in there. So it may be that you just simply maybe shape it a little narrower there, but that's your choice. You're the designer, you get to do that portion. So I've got this to where I want it. My seam allowance looks pretty good. If it was a little bit bumpy and you want to trim anything, that's your opportunity to trim any seam allowance there. I'm going to turn mine all the way out to the stitching. Got a fairly good curve on that. So after you do a couple of these over and over, you realize, this works pretty quick. Okay, I've got this portion. Now I need to add the back side of my mitten. So we're going to do right sides together again. Okay, now that we're back, we're going to be putting this right sides together with the back piece, piece A that we don't want to leave out, right sides together here. And the thumb portion will be on the interior. So we're going to have to make sure we kind of tuck him out of the way so we don't catch him in our seam. We are going to, I usually want to work with the palm side up because I've got seams that I'm going to have to deal with as I stitch around the outside portion here. So by right sides together and the palm portion up, I'm going to go again in and pin around this portion. Now, as soon as you get to the thumb area, you're going to do the same thing I did. How do I deal with this area? And you simply kind of nudge the knit because we're working with a knit. It has some give. Nudge that seam where you stop stitching on the thumb, kind of in an outward direction, and catch it with a pin so that your seam will just clip that seam. You don't want to leave a hole there, so you want to bring it out to the cut edge of the piece A and match it up nicely. And then just continue your pinning up around the mitten. See, I've got a little shedding here. I've got red polka dots on my gray palm. And we're going to shape this portion up around. Now the pinning again is really important at this point. I'm not, like I said, I'm not a huge pinner in the past. You can even ask my mom. She would be like, yep, she just likes to put the pieces together and keep on moving. But when we're working with something that has so much loft to it, it's nice to have those cut edges right on top of each other. Now we're at that seam where the palm was at, where we joined the palm and the wrist portion. Just lay it to one side, probably towards the wrist area, because as you go up and around, this seam will want to easily just go along with the presser foot and lay flat. So I'm going to put a pin there and then one at the wrist area. And as we bring it back to the machine, remember again, this is where we're going to run about a 1/4 to 3/8 inch seam. We're going to do a little reinforced stitch at the beginning of this. You can use your pins to help you kind of get it going under the machine. And then again, I'm taking the pin out at the very beginning and then jumping it to the back behind where my needle is so that I can kind of use it to help me direct again that sweater material through the machine. Remember to stop often and make sure that your cut edges are one over the top of the other because it can easily walk away on you. And at this point, you don't want a hole in your mitten. You want to make sure that you have everything positioned properly. Okay. Kind of go slow as you get to those lumpy seams. Sometimes we think, well, I'm getting to a thick space, I need to speed up. And if you speed up too quickly and the presser foot comes at a weird angle, you can break a needle. So that's not fun. So let's avoid that. Slow and steady will get us around the curve of our mitten. And instead of keep repositioning your pins to help you feed that through the machine, taking them out as you approach. You want to get them. If you hit a pin, and I've done this before, I've actually hit a pin square on with the needle and had it end up wedged down into my machine, and it made a V as it was wedged down in there. I had to take the machine apart to get it out. So not the most fun to have happen when you're in the middle of a project. Anything that slows us down just is never enjoyable. So I'm keep moving my pins back. We're getting to that last section where The seam of the palm is on the outside edge. And again, slow down as you get to that thick space. Go through it nice and steady. Our machines are meant to do work. They have horsepower. Let them do their work. We're just there to guide the machine over the fabric. Sometimes people want to oversteer and things, and I'm like, the machine it knows exactly what it needs to do. We just need to sit there and guide it through to create our projects. Okay, reinforced stitch at the end. And we'll take it out of the machine. And yes, it does look a little like a porcupine with all the pins on there, and it may look just a little bit distorted, but the yarns will relax and give us the nice shape on the top curve that we want. Now, the first time I did this, my sewing looked really sad. It just kind of jig-jogged all the way around until I realized the pin method of helping feed it through the machine so that I would get a nice clean curve there. And at any point, you need to use a scissors to kind of clean up that curve so you don't have a lot of thickness. Because of the cable in this sweater, there are some areas that are a little thicker that I can maybe reduce my seam allowance just a tiny bit. Make it at least look good to me on the inside. And then we're going to turn the entire mitten right side out. This is kind of the fun part because it's like everything that we want to see is on the inside. So it's kind of the reveal as we roll it over. Now kind of gently turn that because we don't want to distort the wrist area. But look, we have a mitten in the making. Here we go. All those seams turn like that. Remember that lint roller. He's going to go to work picking up everything on your surface here. It's like I need a new sheet on there. It's getting messy. Okay, the next thing we need to do is create the line. Well, one mitten's good, but remember I have my second one already done. So if you're just beginning, you've got one mitten done, you need to make the other. And as you turn it, you'll realize now you have a left and a right. The next step is to take your lining fabrics. Now, as I was working on this, I realized that the plush fabric I have has stretch in one direction, but not much in the other. So I made sure that my seam allowances are fairly narrow in this because you need a little bit of give as you put your hand in there. So this one was maybe not as flexible as the other fleeces that I purchased. So maybe kind of keep that in mind too, but they still work and they feel nice and cozy. So in the creation of this, you're going to do the exact same steps. You've done them twice. Now this is 3 and 4. B and C together. Remember that the lofted soft portion is going to be the inside, so you have to have right sides together. You're going to do the exact same stitching where you're going to go across the palm, up and around the thumb, and stop parallel to the seam. Once you get that portion done, you don't have to turn this because then that becomes the lining of your mitten like this. It doesn't need to be turned. We're going to be working seams exposed. When you're working with this lofted thing, you're going to definitely want, or a Sherpa kind of fabric, your pins will definitely come in handy because all that squishing loft, it wants to play one over the other. So your pins will really come in handy at this point. Again, we're going to stitch up and around, taking the thumb portion off to the side, just like we did on our exterior. But this time we're working with the thumb facing us. Before we had the thumb tucked inside. So on this one, you're going to work around here, kind of turn the seam to flatten it, run over it, and down, and have your lining created. The lining then goes inside the mitten to secure. Remember I said I got going on these, and this was my initial pair, so they've already been worn. Then I found this fun blue sweater, and I thought, more. So I'm going to pull these apart. I'm not going to show you quite yet how we do this. Okay, we've got an outer portion of a mitten created. This, though it looks a little fuzzy here, it has even longer loft on the inside. So I'm actually going to put it on, and you can see it's not perfect around the edges, but it's going to be so warm. This is how to easily nest them together. Actually put the lining on your hand, and then, kind of like you're playing puppets, you slide the outer portion, the sweater portion, over the top of the lining, adjusting everything like this. And then all we have to do is deal with the cuff. So since we have them, I have it in steps here for adding the cuff on this one, we're going to do this portion as our demo for the cuff. Now we created the cuffs back in, I think, lesson 2, if I'm not mistaken. You are going to want to put the right side of your cuff, so the seam will be on the inside. The portion you want to actually see when your mittens are completed is going to go against the lining of your mitten. So I'm matching up my seam allowances. It's like one of my seams may have stretched over the other. It's fun to be able to do a quick adjustment. No one has to know later except for you. I'm going to line up my seams here. I'm going to put a temporary pin in this one. And then line up the seams on the other side. They don't have to be exactly over the top of each other, but close counts. So we're going to put a pin here. And now I'm going to put the right side of my cuff on the inside, facing the lining portion of my mitten. The biggest thing is to remember is the right side against the lining. And then I want to put the seam that was in my cuff so that it ends up on the outside of my hand. So here's the seam of my cuff, and it's on the outer portion of my hand. So that I am going to line it up with this seam here and the seam of my cuff, one on top of the other. And yes, this is thick. I do understand that. There's a lot of fabric here. Oops, just a second. As I put my cuff in, that's the finished edge. It needs to go in first so that the cut edge is matched up with the outside or with my lining. Caught my own mistake. Okay, seams matched up, one on top of on the outer portion of the hand. Learn from all the things I sometimes get going and you just get too excited, you want to finish. Okay, the cuff there, seam matched up. We're going to put the right side inside. And at this point, it pretty much just lays right inside of your mitten. So we've got to match this one up. Then I'm going to put a couple more pins in this to hold it in place. Now, this seam is not very long, but it is kind of a tight curve. And you will probably find yourself holding your breath as you sew this. Remember to breathe. Our brains need oxygen to function. So we're going to put this under the machine. It doesn't matter really what portion you start with, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay it like this. So I'm sewing on the cuff portion that's facing up. I found it a little bit easier to maneuver under the machine that way. So I'm going to put my presser foot down, again, about 1/4 to 3/8 inch seam. And once I have it in position, making sure all my cut edges are aligned on top of each other. I don't need to reinforce stitch at the very beginning because as I come around, I'm going to overlap my stitching. This is not a fast race. This is kind of just slowly working along, inching our way around that opening so that we catch all the layers. We can maneuver it. It's a little bit, you're kind of squashing your mitten down, but because it's not a very long seam, you can quickly get around. Now, I did most of mine. Once I got done doing a straight stitch, I worried a little bit about fraying on the very edge here, and because this is a portion where it's going to come off and on your hand quite often. So I did go back around and zigzag over the edge, make sure everybody stays one on top of the other. And you can see, even for me, and I've made a few pair already, that I'm almost to the halfway point. Kind of feed it under there nice and slow. Just got about 1.5 inches left. and we can have this one finished. So if you'd like, I'm going to overlap my straight stitching, then cut thread. And like I said, if you would like, you can then go back with the machine, set it to a very wide zigzag, and actually zigzag into the knit, off the edge, into the knit, off the edge, around that edge to give it one more secure stitch. Now, the cuff portion comes out like this, and then turns back over the seam so that everything is covered. And then you have that wonderful fleece on the inside of your mitten, and you're ready to go out for a snowball fight. If you make a couple extras pair, you can go out and have 2 snowball fights when your mittens get wet. But the fun of making mittens from old sweaters never ends. I think this is going to have to be my next one, and I need to find some hot pink lining to accent the hot pink in this old sweater. So, creating mittens, upcycling those sweaters that you've either worn and had wonderful experiences in, can keep having a life as mittens. Thanks for joining me today.